Hey, good morning, church. It's great to be with you. My name is Sawyer. I'm a pastor at Bayview Glen Church, and I'm so honored and happy to be joining you for the next couple weeks. Just a little bit of a background about myself. I grew up about 2 hours north of Toronto. If you're familiar with Collingwood, Wasaga Beach, there's a little farm town just outside there called Stayner. Postal code is EIEIO. That's where I grew up. I came to the city for school, met my wife Rebecca when we were both part of a church plant, and now we have a baby and a dog and a house. Expensive hobbies. But if I seem a little tired this morning, mind your business. Lucy decided to wake up an hour early today. That's a nice surprise. All this to say, in all my spare time, I was reading a news story pretty recently about a woman who was hiking and she got lost off of the trail. She lost her way from the trail. She actually ended up wandering in the wilderness for several days. She wasn't able to find her way back, and she perished out in the woods. What's kind of ironic and sad about it was when her body was located, she was less than a kilometer from the trail. She was so close, but once she got lost from it, she wandered and wandered and wandered, and she never found her way back. And this has been well documented that when people are lost, humans tend to walk in circles. We're not good at walking straight. You've probably seen this in movies. They pass a rock, and the characters say, I feel like we passed that rock an hour ago. We've been walking in circles this whole time. But needless to say, when people don't know where they're going, they tend to walk in circles. We don't have anything to follow. We don't manage to get anywhere. And I don't want to speak for everyone, but this feels true of my generation. I'm born in the 90s, and there seems to be a general sense of lostness amongst my peers, at least in the Western world. The prior ideals and goals of previous generations are shown to be either shams or they're simply unattainable. There's no way I'm ever going to be able to afford a house. And how can I ever find love and get married and find a spouse? And so I'm just wandering through my life. I've kind of tumbled through my 20s, and now I'm going through my 30s with no sense of purpose. Or perhaps you're on the other side of this. Maybe you did get the spouse and the house and the dog and the cottage, and you're looking at all of it and wondering, is this it? Is there any other grand purpose for my life? Or you're retired. Maybe you're an empty nester and you're looking around and wondering, okay, what does God have for me in these ensuing decades of my life? Or you know what? Maybe you're not even wrestling with a big sense of existential vagueness. Maybe you're staring down the barrel of a very important and pressing decision and you don't know what to do. And in the midst of it, you feel alone. So needless to say, this sense of feeling lost can find us really in any season of life. Doesn't matter where you are. It's a very familiar feeling of what do I do now? And in the midst of our lostness, we can ask this question. Where is God when I'm lost? Where is God when I'm lost? Is he with me? Can he guide me? Will he guide me? How do I find him in the middle of all this? So I would invite you to turn in your Bibles to Psalm 25 as we seek to answer this question, where is God when I'm lost? Psalm 25, let's jump to it. These will be the best 2 hours of your life, so buckle up. This is a bit of a longer psalm, so stick with me. I'm going to begin in verse 1, Psalm 25. I'm reading in the ESV. To you, O Lord, I lift up my soul. O my God, in you I trust. Let me not be put to shame. Let not my enemies exult over me. Indeed, none who wait for you shall be put to shame. They shall be ashamed who are wantonly treacherous. Make me to know your ways, O Lord. Teach me your paths. Lead me in your truth and teach me, for you are the God of my salvation. For you I wait all the day long. Remember your mercy, O God, and your steadfast love, for they have been from of old. Remember not the sins of my youth or my transgressions. According to your steadfast love, remember me for the sake of your goodness, O God. Good and upright is the Lord. Therefore, he instructs sinners in the way. He leads the humble in what is right and teaches the humble his way. All the paths of the Lord are steadfast love and faithfulness for those who keep his covenants and his testimonies. For your name's sake, O Lord, pardon my guilt, for it is great. Who is the man who fears the Lord? Him will he instruct in the way that he should choose. His soul shall abide in well-being, and his offspring shall inherit the land. The friendship of the Lord is for those who fear him, and he makes known to them his covenant. My eyes are ever toward the Lord, for he will pluck my feet out of the net. Turn to me and be gracious to me, for I am lowly and afflicted. The troubles of my heart are enlarged. Bring me out of my distress. Consider my afflictions and my trouble, and forgive all my sins. Consider how many are my foes, and with what violent hatred they hate me. O guard my soul and deliver me. Let me not be put to shame, for I take refuge in you. May integrity and uprightness preserve me, for I wait for you. Redeem Israel, O God, out of all his troubles. We're in the second week of this series called You Are Here, which is basically learning to see and recognize and walk with God amidst all of the various seasons and emotional terrains that life holds for us. The book of Psalms, it was the ancient hymn book of the church. You can also think of these as prayers, and these were used to guide the church in her worship and also to show her faithful patterns of practice of what does it mean to see God, to find him, to say to him, you are here, in the various facets and seasons and circumstances that we find ourselves in. And so Psalm 25, it's considered to be one of the, if not the greatest psalm, perhaps greatest passages in the Bible, that shows how God guides. And it may surprise you to learn that Psalm 25, it doesn't specifically talk about how to get guidance. It talks about the type of person that is guided by God. There's no secret code here. There's no formula for, okay, if you come, you're going to get the guidance. It doesn't talk about that, but it describes the type of person who is guided by God. So this can already change our perspective when we approach this topic from asking, how do I get what I want out of God, versus asking, how can I be the type of person that God will guide? And we see all of this in verse 12. If you jump back there, Psalm 25:12 says, who is the man who fears the Lord? And we're going to see two things. Him will he instruct in the way that he should choose. Him he will instruct, there's the promise of guidance, in the way he should choose. That's a purpose of life. You will be instructed in the way that you should choose. And both of these things are promised by God for the person who fears the Lord. Okay, well, what is that language of fearing the Lord? It's really the Old Testament way of describing what it means to have faith in God. The person who fears God is the person who follows him, who's devoted to walking with him and following in his practices. And David will show in Psalm 25 the characteristics, at least three, there's many more, of this type of person who fears the Lord, who has a purpose for their life, and who will be guided by God as they walk in this purpose. So the first characteristic that we is simply this. The person who is guided by God are those trained in God's ways, those who are trained in God's ways. In verse 4, David opens with this. He says to God, make me to know your ways, O Lord. Teach me your paths. If you want to be guided by God, you kind of have to know what he says. Do you even know his guidance in the first place? The person who's guided by God is the person who knows him and is listening to him. And this is not the same as what's mentioned in verse 12. Verse 12, David is referring to the specific plan for his life, but he opens by first asking God to tell him who he is. What are his priorities? What's his character? What's his nature? Before he says, show me the plan for my life, he says, I want to know what you revealed across the board. Before I ask about knowing my way, I want to know about your way. This is the bedrock. This is the foundation, a prerequisite, a necessary condition of being led by God is actually knowing how he is leading in the first place. The author of Hebrews puts this very well, a very timely illustration. Chapter 5, verses 13 and 14, the author says this. For everyone who lives on milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, since he's a child. But solid food is for the mature, for those who have their powers of discernment trained by constant practice to distinguish good from evil. Discernment is for those who've moved beyond milk and are now tackling solid foods. Our baby is in the middle of this transition, little Lucy, and she's kind of starting to work on solid foods, and it takes time. She isn't ready for everything yet. I tried to give her a pepperoni stick last week. She didn't like it, Mama didn't like it. It was a bad time. But one of the marks of maturity is a growing skill in discernment. And the verb for discernment here is literally to taste, to recognize various elements and features of things and being able to identify them in the real world. This is a mark of a mature believer. Think of if you're trying to learn a new language, when you first are listening to people speak that language, it's like a blur. And as you begin to learn more of the language, you start to identify speech patterns and words in this way. I was with Lucy at a pool program for babies, teach your baby to swim. And out in the lobby, all the moms were talking about how they loved this Indian matchmaking show. They loved watching it, and they wanted to learn the language. I don't know if it was Hindi. They wanted to learn the language so they could appreciate the show more. Now, if you're trying to learn a new language, you buy a dictionary and you put it on your bedside table. Maybe in the morning you flip through the pages for inspiration. You could put your hand on it. Are you going to learn that language quickly? No. Okay, what if you went to a service or a gathering where they spoke that language for an hour? Would you get more immersed in that language? Perhaps. But this takes time. It takes effort. And this is the very thing that our consumer culture hates. We want answers now. I don't want the work. I want answers. And so that's why people go to psychics. That's why we read our horoscope. What should I do with my life? Well, I was born in October. Therefore, I should be a used car salesman or a belly dancer. Good. Problem solved. But this is not what we've seen here. It's easy to come to God and I just want an answer. I want the abstract guidance. I don't want the relationship. I know I should know more about who you are and what you revealed, but God, I just want the guidance. I don't want the guide. Give me the answers. I don't want the work. I want discernment without discipleship in this way. This can be a danger of what we're saying if we want answers from God, but we don't even know what he said in the first place. If you want to know the difference between godliness and ungodliness and making those decisions in your life, what's the difference between the wise and the foolish, the right and the wrong? Do you know what God has said? Do you know the guide? Or are you just looking for the map? Just give me the map, God. I don't want the guide. Interestingly, that actually may not be what's best. It feels like it's best because it's easier, but if you're trying to climb Mount Everest, I can draw you a map up, but you need a guide. J.I. Packer, he puts it like this. I think the best I've ever heard it. I think it's in his book, Knowing God. He says, imagine you're trying to get to a destination. You're maybe an hour out and you're driving through a town. You kind of know where you need to go, but not exactly sure. You see a local, so you pull over and you say, hey, excuse me, I'm trying to get to this location. And so they describe to you all the steps. Okay, you're going to go north for about, 20 minutes, make a right, take the second exit on the roundabout, go straight under the bridge, drive through the farmer's field. Don't bother the cows too much. You keep going, make a left, right, down, up, and then you should be there. Kind of listening. You look at him. He looks at you. And he says, you know what? I'm going there myself. I'll just jump in the car and I'll show you the way. Now look. Now that you have this guide in the car with you, your situation has dramatically improved. But guess what? You haven't really been given any more cognitive content. You don't have a map now, you have a guide. But you're not bothered by the fact that you're still less sure about where you're going because the person's right with you. And they'll tell you, go straight. Make the left here. Keep going through the stop sign. Make the right again. Keep going there. And they're giving you the instructions one step at a time. You still don't know the whole trajectory and all the ways and methods and steps of getting there, but it doesn't bother you anymore. So maybe what you don't need is a map. Maybe you need a guide whose presence is so faithful and steadfast that they will be with you every step of the way. You need a guide. And this is what you see here in Psalm 25. Who is the type of person that knows the voice of their guide? Do you know God's voice? Would you recognize it if he was speaking to you, if he is speaking to you in this way? We start to see really a shift in our approach of these things, that guidance isn't really what God gives you, it's what he does for you. So the first mark of the type of person that is guided by God is simply those who are trained in God's ways. Do you know the guide? Do you know his voice? Do you know what he's telling you? That's the first part. The second is this. The second mark of those guided by God is those obedient to God's ways. Let's look at verses 8 to 10. Good and upright is the Lord, therefore he instructs sinners in the way. He leads the humble in what is right and teaches the humble his way. All the paths of the Lord are steadfast love and faithfulness for those who keep his covenant and his testimony. So God will instruct those. It's a promise of guidance again, but it's interesting because it says he will teach the humble, and his paths are love and faithfulness for those who follow him, for those who obey. It's interesting the author would talk about humility so much in the context of obedience. We hear the word obey and we think, obey, just do as you're told. But he's really outlining and illustrating the posture of the heart, because at least in the Greek, the word for obey, it's a compound verb. It's two verbs. The first is to hear or to listen, and the second word is underneath, to listen underneath someone else. What's the point of having the guide in the car with you and he says turn right and you say, I'm going to go left? Okay, well then what's the point of having the guide there and listening in the first place? So what does this have to do with obedience and guidance? Well, simply this. It seems like humility is the cost of entry for following God. This is the price of admission. If you want to be led by God, you kind of have to assume at the outset, hey, you might know the way better than I do. You might have more information on this. You might have more insight. So I'm going to let you have the say, and I'm going to follow because I don't know. Pride stands in the way of instruction, but humility makes someone teachable and makes them pliable in this way. And what's the alternative? If we're not following God's way, if I choose, I don't want to obey, but I'm still asking for guidance, it's like saying, okay, God, show me the way, but I'm going to do it how I want to. And that sounds silly on paper, but we can look at our own lives and do a quick diagnostic. If I'm so concerned about what this decision in my life should be or where I should go, but there's an area in my life where I know I'm not quite walking in obedience of how God wants me to, then I'm asking for guidance, but I'm not following the guide. Perhaps there's a person in your life that you know God is leading you to be reconciled towards, or you're holding on to bitterness still. You're still holding on to anger. You're not walking in generosity. Maybe you're sleeping with someone you shouldn't be sleeping with in this way. Perhaps one of the steps in being guided by God is walking in trust and obedience and humility in this area of our life. Though to me it doesn't make sense, it doesn't seem comfortable, it's not how I would do things, but I know for a fact that this is where my guide is leading me. Then if I want to follow God, I need to follow him in here. Otherwise we're saying, God, use me, but don't expect me to act the way that you want me to. Not that you need to be perfect, but we're called to follow God faithfully, though we're going to stumble along the way, even if it doesn't make sense, because there's this element of humility and trust. It says, all the paths of the Lord are steadfast love and faithfulness. This is how God describes himself to Moses on Sinai. Steadfast love and faithfulness. Faithfulness means trustworthy. It's how you describe your spouse. They are faithful. They're keeping their promises. So God says, hey, I love you and you can trust me. And these are the paths that I'm leading for you. Would you be humble enough to follow me? George MacDonald, he wrote an incredibly influential fairy tale called The Princess and the Goblin. You may not have heard of it, but I'm sure it's actually touched areas of your life. C.S. Lewis, he references this a lot of times in his own work. Tolkien, when he was writing Lord of the Rings, how he depicted goblins was strongly influenced by this fairy tale. And even G.K. Chesterton said this is one of the greatest works he's ever read in his life. And it really illustrates this. Let me summarize it very briefly. There's a kingdom of humans and there's a kingdom of goblins underneath the surface of the earth. And things are getting a little bit crazy. Goblins are popping off. So the king takes his young princess Irene and he says to her, I'm sending you out of the kingdom. You're going to go stay in this house and you'll be safe over there. Okay? Now, conveniently for her, the house also has her grandmother. It's who she's staying with. And her grandmother is a fairy godmother. Very convenient to have. So they're staying in the home and they soon realize that even underneath this house, there's also goblins. And they're threatening to break through. So the fairy godmother says this to Irene. She says, hey, take this kind of ball of thread. I want you to take it. You hold on to one end. I'm going to hold on to the other. If anything goes crazy, if the goblins start causing trouble, you just follow your end and it will lead you to me. Now, there's a couple caveats. First is, this thread is so thin and so fine when it's stretched out, you can't see it, but you can feel it. And it's magic thread in that if you turn back while you're following the thread, it disappears. You've only got one option. You've got to follow it. So a few days go by, and Irene wakes up one morning and she notices that goblins are in the house. They've broken through. And so she grabs her end of the thread and she's going to follow it to try and get to her fairy godmother. The thread leads her out of her room, but oddly enough, the thread does not go up the stairs, even though that's where her godmother's room is. It goes down the stairs. That doesn't seem like a good idea. There's goblins down there. But she follows the thread down the stairs. And the thread keeps going outside of the house. But that's further away from the godmother. I don't know if this is such a good idea, but she keeps following the thread, and the thread starts leading her further down the hill towards the caves. That's goblin territory. That's also not a good idea. She keeps following the thread, and the thread leads her to this huge wall of stones and rocks, and the thread goes straight through it. And she gets to the wall. She's very frustrated. She's overwhelmed. She's sad. She starts crying. What is going on here? This godmother isn't leading me very well. And after kind of a few moments, she gathers herself together and she starts to pick away at this wall of rocks. She's moving these boulders. They're cutting up her little hands. And when she finally digs through it all, on the other side of that wall, she finds her best friend. It's a young boy named Curdy. He says, "How did you find me? The goblins, they kidnapped me. They brought me down here, and you dug through the very wall in my cell. Now I'm free." She said, "Oh, I get it. My godmother was leading me to you. This was where the thread was going." He says, "Cool, let's get out of here." But Irene says, "No, no, 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 no. That thread, it keeps going further down into the caverns and the caves." He says, "Are you nuts? That's goblin territory. You just got me out of here. I'm not going back to them." And she says, "I got to follow the thread. Even if I don't get it, if it makes no sense, I've got to follow the thread." And this is so true for those of us who are seeking to be led by God. We're called to trust him humbly and walk with him, even though we may not understand. If you're here today saying, "You know what? If I wasn't following God, if I wasn't a Christian, I probably would have been married by now. There were some really good people that I passed up." Or maybe you're thinking to yourself, "If I wasn't following God, I would have taken a different career. I probably would have made a lot more money. I'd be a lot more comfortable. I feel like I could provide better for my family." But we're called to follow the thread, to follow him, the one whose paths are loving and steadfast. That's the second mark of those who are guided by God. First, we saw those who are trained in his ways. Secondly, those who are obedient to God's ways, following him. The third thing that we see is this, and this is surprising. The third mark of those who are guided by God is those who trust in God's grace. Those trusting in God's grace, God's care, his graciousness, his mercy, his redemption in all these, his ability to use bad things not to destroy us, but to further his plans. And there's two sides to this. We see that your enemies can't stop God's plan for your life. In verses 2 and 3, David says, "O my God, in you I trust. Let me not be put to shame. Let not my enemies exult over me. Indeed, none who wait for you shall be put to shame. They shall be ashamed who are wantonly treacherous." So I'm trusting in God's grace that my enemies can't ruin God's plan for my life. They don't have more power over God's plan and purposes than he does. And the other side of that coin is this: your mistakes can't stop God's plan for your life. In verse 7, David says, "Remember not the sins of my youth or my transgressions. According to your steadfast love, remember me. For the sake of your goodness, O God." David's saying, don't forget me. Don't look over me. I see what I've done, and it's terrible and wicked, but for the sake of your name and your character, Don't forget me. Still guide me. Basically, every other stanza in this whole psalm is Dave asking for forgiveness and asking for guidance. God, I know that I have wandered so far from you. I've done horrible things. I've hurt others. I've hurt myself, but I'm trusting in your grace that it's greater than my sin. It's greater than what I've done. It's greater than what's been done to me, and that you will still accomplish your plans and your purposes. And the good news, my friends, is that if you feel this way, you're in good company. This is what we see all throughout God's word as examples of God using imperfect people to accomplish his plans. Martin Luther would say that God draws straight lines with crooked sticks. Look at the example of Jacob. Jacob sins against Isaac and Esau. He lies and he cheats, and he's estranged from his family. He's exiled. It seems like, okay, that's a start to a pretty lousy life, being kicked out and burning your relationships with your loved ones. Yet when he's out there in exile, he meets the love of his life, Rachel. And from her comes the Messiah, Jesus himself, from her line. So was that God's plan B for Jacob's life? Oh, if you'd really obeyed, we could have done some awesome things, but you kind of screwed up and I'm just fudging it together now. No, not at all. It's basically Romans 9, 10, and 11. God will accomplish his plans, whether we respond in faithfulness or unfaithfulness. And it's easy for us today, thinking about, our actions and God's plans, and thinking, if I do one wrong thing, I might screw it all up. We think of it like a big international flight, and I've got 4 connections to make, and if I miss one of them, I mess up the whole rest of the trip. We might think of this like the concept of the one. I need to marry the right person. What happens if I marry the wrong person? Well, okay, if there's one special person that you're supposed to marry, but instead you don't marry them, you marry this person, well, what if I'm having the wrong kids? Now I'm having kids that shouldn't have been born. And this person is married and they're having kids that shouldn't have been born. And it just screws up all of the human race for generations and generations from marrying one wrong person. That sounds silly, doesn't it? Yeah. But do we think about that when we think about God's plan for our own life? Or are we trusting in him that I don't have to know the way and I don't have to be perfect because God knows the way, and he sent his son Jesus, who was perfect, so I can trust in God's character, I can trust in his son, that he will use all things together for his glory and his good if I'm seeking to walk with him regardless of my past. Friends, that is a beautiful invitation. It should take the pressure off of us from trying to do the right thing. Instead, I'm just trying to get closer to my guide. I want to know more of his voice, and I want to ask for the grace and the faith and the trust to walk as he is leading me, trusting me that his grace is sufficient where I fall short. That's the invitation that we see today in Psalm 25. To quote Martin Luther again, this is the cry of our hearts. I know not the way God leads me, but well do I know my guide. To conclude what we've been looking at today in Psalm 25, the Bible doesn't talk much about how to get guidance. It talks about the person that gets guided. Am I the type of person that God can guide? Am I willing to follow the thread? Do I know his voice? Do I know his word? And when he is speaking to me, through his word, through his spirit, through prayer, through the church, am I going to be humble enough to follow him when it doesn't make sense, when it seems very uncomfortable, when it doesn't seem to maximize my immediate material pleasure and financial status in this way? Am I willing to follow him? And am I trusting in his character and his grace for when I fall short? So here's 3 questions along these different dimensions we've been looking at today. Where do I need to learn God's ways? Is there practically an area in your life you're looking for wisdom and you could see what God has said? Where do I need to learn God's ways? For most of us, the second question is probably the most pressing. Where do I need to follow God's ways? If you're not sure, would you ask him? Would he reveal to you? What is he calling you towards? Does he want you to step into something and to step away from something else? For his paths are loving and faithful. Or where do I need to trust in God's grace? Where do I need to trust in him more than myself? His providence, his power, and his perfection versus my ability to get it all right. Where is God's Spirit leading us today? I pray that he would be giving you wisdom and comfort and encouragement and discernment as we seek to follow him together. And now, church, let's continue together in worship.